everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of On the Couch, where we talk about Couchform and all the cool ideas behind and within it. Today, we're going to be talking about something very deeply philosophical, but also ties very easily into how we communicate information in any sort of medium. Of course, we'll specifically dive into how it's relevant to roleplay and what it can kind of inform in how you either play with others or you play your own characters, etc., etc. Now, before we get into all that, we're going to do the thing where we introduce ourselves.
I propose the reversed order today.
Ah, she's changing it up. All right.
You gotta mix it up, yeah.
It's me first. Hello, everybody. I'm Solus. I've roleplayed for like 4 years. God, sooner or later it'll be 4.5 years. I think it was earlier part of 2020 that I started. I'll have to look back at any existing records of when I joined the Purple Lotus, because that Discord being new makes that very difficult. But yeah, what else do I say here? I've roleplayed for 4 years. Big time, big enjoyer of theory and theory crafting and critique, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think that's good enough. Your turn.
All right, hello. I'm Silent. I've been role-playing in VR chat for like 3 years now. I like doing roleplay. I like talking about roleplay. I suppose I've somewhat expanded out in the theater/acting bubble umbrella. I'm not really sure what to call it. Kind of been looking at improv, been looking at like immersive theater stuff. Just, pretty cool stuff in general. But anyway, Solus.
That's me.
Yeah, so if a tree falls in the forest and we weren't allowed to, or we weren't around to hear it, then would it make a sound?
You see, it wouldn't, and the falling of that tree wouldn't even exist to begin with, which is why we're out here in this forest, just in case a tree falls. In the off chance that any of these trees were to fall anywhere around here, then they would make a sound, and we would be around to hear it, and that sound and the tree falling would exist.
Does that mean that we're causing the trees to fall? Because if we weren't here, they wouldn't.
Well, causation is a whole different branch of philosophy that we're not prepared to delve into today. The universe is large and vast, and reality has many different causes that are out of our control. I had to take off my jacket there. Yeah, this is only a sliver, a taste, if you will, of the deep philosophical roots behind what we're talking about here. But that's the title. The subject of today is that reality is subjective, which on its own is very deeply philosophical. So we'll kind of define what we mean here. When we say reality is subjective, in a general sense, what we mean is that subjective reality is reality. So when you perceive something that is real within your perception, and that means anything outside of that is not real. So things are granted reality by being perceived by you.
I would like to add really quickly, in a roleplay context.
Well, okay, I was starting general, and then I was gonna get into roleplay.
Okay.
Because I am very interested in this is my favorite principle for many reasons. I want to put that out there. This is my favorite for many reasons. But one of them is the fact that it's deeply
it's
philosophical.
Just like if somebody like tunes in to our deeply philosophical conversation here, this is I guess in the context of doing role play and being,
Okay.
in the world of the role play.
All right, fine. I'll let go of the philosophy. So we'll go ahead and just dive into the roleplay part of this then. So I will slightly expand it to all media, right? So movies, literature, etc.
Hmm.
That from the point of view of the person who is consuming the media, only the things that happen within it are real to the perceiver. So when you're watching a movie, something must happen on screen for it to be real to you. Uh, you kind of you've kind of potentially seen some movies before where maybe you were blindsided by something that happened because nothing happened before then to evidence it. That kind of plays off of this principle. So, well, we're going to talk later about how to actually use that and how film nowadays actually uses that. But to bring this back into the roleplay scope, this perceiver is the player. We are each other's perceivers. We are each other's audience. So the bold text that we have for this principle is that from the point of view of the player, only what happens in the LARP has reality. LARP is not literature. LARP is action. So what we mean by that is that reality for us as players is dependent on what we see. So this is we're effectively pushing all of this scope of like what is real within the setting to the people that are perceiving it, not to the people that are acting out certain things. And that kind of touches on a lot of different points, and it pushes us towards certain mindsets on how we're actually portraying things in the medium. But to basically just start it off, there are a lot of different questions that can come up, right? Like, for example, how is it even practical? If we're thinking in this like very philosophical sort of mindset, how can we make that practical, right? Because it is
Yeah.
very like, modern rationalists of us just sit there and say, well, it's not real because I didn't see it, right? But like, how can we make this like, you know,
I
pragmatic for us?
suppose I could speak on this. I'm actually I actually wouldn't really be prepared to have the conversation of like reality is subjective, like outside the context of a story, but like in the context of a story, I don't think this is philosophical at all, right? Like obviously it kind of sounds like it is, but like I think it's just like if in the context of a story, right? Like if you have your magic circle and you're kind of like in the world of the story, like reality is subjective is just the way that it is, right? Like that is how stories work. Um, if you are a player or like an audience member or somebody who's observing the story in some way, shape, or form, um, the only parts of that story that are real are the parts that you see. Those are the only parts of the story that are real to you. You don't know anything that anything that you don't see, right? Like in your mental vision of what's going on of the story, literally doesn't exist because kind of like the story is playing out in your head to some extent, and any part of that you don't see just is not in your head. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so in the context of stories, I don't think this is philosophical at all. Um, and so if you're writing or designing or doing something for an audience in that case, you kind of have to consider that. Um, if you do not, even if something's supposed to be a mystery or something's supposed to kind of be surprising, um, if you don't provide some form of evidence or some way to ground that mystery or that surprise into your story ahead of time, then it's going to feel like it comes out of nowhere because it literally has just come out of nowhere, right? It
Mm-hmm.
was nowhere up until that point. Um, and so it rightfully will feel like it has come out of nowhere because it has, because you haven't provided any evidence for that twist.
Right. Like we probably don't think about it as much when it happens in film, but it happens all the time, right? The horror genre, everything around horrors and thrillers rely on this notion of suspense by showing something is going to happen to, either scare or thrill someone, the viewer, into the thing that actually happens, right? So, the not so common sense person sees, the lights turn on when they know that no one is home, and they start slowly walking toward the house. And then the music starts building up. And as the person watching, that something's going to happen, that they're going to go up and they're probably going to get, like, stabbed from behind or whatever. And you just know this is going to happen, but this person's walking. And but they don't, right? Everything's building up, and you're like, I know this thing's going to happen. And then it happens, and you're like, whoa, oh my God. Like, it works because as the viewer, you're not given all of the information that of when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen and what exactly is going to happen. You're not given everything, but you are given the evidence of what is needed to understand the scene that's going to happen. And the surprise, the excitement is in how exactly it unfolds. In kind of more dramatic contexts, you in shows where characters often betray each other, or there's some sort of like surprising betrayal, and you see it in the way that characters behave with each other, or like maybe there's like an off scene of like one character doing something suspicious, or showing that they're about to betray someone. Then you're like, oh shit, this is going down, right? Something's going to happen, and you're basically just in suspense in this like kind of excitement, waiting to see what's going to happen. If none of that gets evidence and it just out of nowhere, haha, I betrayed you, I've been playing this thing for the last 5 months, and you kind of feel cheated, right? Like, I wish I had known about this earlier so this would have any sort of value. But if it doesn't happen early, if it doesn't get shown earlier, you don't get that. So that's why it works so well. That's
You know,
why it's so
perhaps,
common.
and perhaps like, perhaps when you have that like unsatisfying twist, I've seen a few of those. Perhaps like in the author's mind, perhaps it was always that way, right? Like, um, perhaps this character has always kind of behaved in this way in their heads. They just forgot to show it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so for you as the audience, when you're watching and you kind of get to the scene, it feels like it kind of comes out of nowhere. And yeah, and that's really what it comes down to, is that when we're telling stories, we kind of have to be aware that what we think the story is not necessarily what the other person next to us thinks the story is, right? Every person is going to kind of have a different experience of that story, and um, especially if you're kind of like in different places, right? Like if you are the writer of a book versus you are the person reading the book, you're definitely going to have different things in your head. And
Right.
that's just with a story, right? That's just with a story where you basically kind of separated into like the writer and the audience, right? And then we can that's just with like a linear story. And then we can get into role play, right?
A dynamic
And
story with that, but like times 40.
yeah, imagine like, well, we don't have a writer anymore, right? What we have instead is we have like 40 or even more people that are all in their own story from their own personal point of view, and every single person has a different idea of what the story is. every single person who is in this role play has an entirely different idea of what's going on. And yeah, so even in a simple kind of like linear story, like a book or a movie, um, you can already have a disconnect between different realities. But like if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of role plays, it's just like, whoa, you know.
Yeah, it's the issue of like potentially not evidencing things enough compounds itself so much because we have that level of dynamic storytelling, right? So that for me kind of speaks volumes to how important this consideration is to our style, and also just kind of generally to consider it at the very least, to consider both the perceiving and the acting side, which we want to very heavily define that action is not the same as perception. These two are very different things. So from the acting side, what you do and what you believe the intent is of what you do as a character or as a player will not always completely match the way that the things are perceived. And in some cases, those can differ very greatly, all the way to the point of no perception at all, right? The thing could just not be real. So, this is very much the principle of not everyone sees what you see. So, it then forces us to question, how do we make up for that, right? How do we mitigate this difference? How do we work with this? How do we kind of focus on the perceiving side as someone who's not perceiving what we're doing, right? We don't see what we're doing. We don't see how other people are perceiving what we're doing. So it's hard. It's not easy. This is very much not an easy one to fully grasp, but it is a mindset shift, right?
All right. Yeah, I have kind of maybe a little hypothetical here.
Sure.
It's pretty bad hypothetical. You know what? Let's just go with it. All right, Solus. So the two of us, we come to a door, and it's not a locked door, but instead there is a boulder in front of this door,
Ah,
and I don't know. We have to get through it for some reason.
okay.
Could you help me? Could you help me push the boulder out of the way?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
We can just like, I don't know. We can just like start pushing it. Maybe in like a roleplay scene, we could like pantomime pushing this boulder out of the way. But then, oh no, a third person walks into the scene, and they see us like, I don't know, pantomiming something. What's going on from that third person's perspective?
Right, so the boulder's invisible in this case, right? And they see
Yeah,
the
yeah,
door.
yeah.
God, this
I don't know.
happens.
We've had a GM kind of like describe that I don't know, there's a boulder in front of the store and we need to push it
Yeah,
out of the way.
yeah. This is one that happens quite a bit in roleplay. Like the persistent state of invisible things, uh, where the person who walks through a door is then told afterward, yeah, there was something in front of that door. There was a barricade there. That door was locked, etc., etc. They have to go back out. They are no longer in the scene. It sucks. Um, so the person who's walking up here, seeing two people try to push something, uh, see these two people physically acting that they are pushing something, and their perception of this scene is now there is something, there is a physical thing in front of that door. Because the alternative is that these two people are effectively actual mimes, and that is very unreasonable compared to the alternative.
Yeah, but I suppose I guess this is a suppose somewhat of a contrived example, but I swear I've seen this exact thing before.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's definitely kind of like if you kind of put yourself into the shoes of the third person, right? There are definitely some things that you can reasonably figure out, right? Like it's probably pretty reasonable to assume that these two people are struggling to push something out of the way, right? Like that's probably pretty reasonable. But the word right there, something. Um, I imagine like you walk into the
Mhm.
scene, probably your first question is going to be something like, what's that? Or what are you pushing? Um, because as the third person, um, if you have if two people are miming like pushing on an invisible object, they know what the invisible object is because they've talked about it, they've been in the scene for a while. But as the third person walking in, you have no way of knowing. Absolutely not. um and in this context, the two people who were there first have a different perception of what's going on than the third person,
Right.
and so you kind of have this disconnect has formed. And I guess this is to do with invisible objects, which come up in VR roleplay quite often because it's hard to put everything in your world, or it's hard to have all the details in your world.
So I wanna know what your thoughts are on this because this Oton actually ended up talking about this a little bit in their before and after silence spiel in the episode they guest starred in, where this LARP is effectively one where it is full of these kind of situations. It puts people in a situation where they're unable to talk and they must effectively mime out everything that they're doing. And it starts with this like 15-minute scene, which is kind of like a short, kind of contained sort of area. Uh, and then, or I guess maybe 5, 15, I don't remember what the timing was, but it ends with this like somewhat long form progressing scene where everyone's doing different things at the same time and building this scene in their head without any words. Once again, everyone's silent and they have like very simplistic, like rectangular prism sort of props to work with. And effectively, by the end of it, we were able to talk about what we thought about the scene and what it was. And some of them were very similar ideas. Some of them were very similar kind of concepts, and some of them were very different. Uh, very different types of stories, even like one being like this intense, suspenseful, dramatic escape, and others being like in a much different sort of mindset, a lot more relaxed. Maybe they were kind of enjoying a lunch or something. And my question to you would be like, what do you think of this in kind of a larger perspective? Like, is it okay that us two pushing this boulder see a boulder while the third person might see something like a refrigerator or like something else, right? Is it okay that they perceive something else in that spot as long as it fits within the context of what they definitely see, which is us two pushing something out of the way?
So I actually have like a very big response to this because I think so. My short answer is yes. I personally am okay with that. My longer response is going to be that I think there are multiple solutions here, right?
Sure.
I think there are multiple solutions to this problem, and pretty much I think most of them are equally valid. You kind of just have to kind of define like what you're doing, and everybody has to be on the same page. Um, I'll kind of like organize these into different camps. I hope I won't miss any of them. I think kind of like the first camp is the uh, like the first way to think about this is like what you see is what you get game. And in a what you see is what you get game, the solution to this problem would be that, well, actually, the two people pushing on the invisible objects is wrong. Like, you shouldn't have engaged in play that brings something that's not in your world into the world. You just shouldn't have engaged in that sort of play in the first place. Maybe there's like a system for this, right? Maybe there's been like some pre-agreed upon system that everybody knows how to use, and then maybe it's fine. But um, in this line of thoughts, it should be upon players to kind of like not bring things into the world that are going to kind of be this ambiguous. Um, Even then, right? Even then, you'll still have problems with subjective reality elsewhere. But this is specifically talking about things that are in your world, in your game, in your game world. You should only engage with the things that are there and are planned for. Um, and you know this can absolutely work in a lot of games. It works. I think probably the best for things that are small because in role plays that are small, you can probably, in VR we have to create our worlds. So if you're creating a small world, it might be reasonable to kind of build the entire world and still have like lots of things to interact with. In
Mm.
a larger role play, this can become quite tough, because we of course have to create our own worlds. So on the team that is creating the world, it might be pretty tough on that team to have the world not feel very empty, right? And like devoid of things that you can interact with. Um, right. So, and this is kind of like a challenge specifically with VR roleplay because we have to create everything from the ground up. But yeah, that's just like one idea, right? That's kind of path number one is players just shouldn't engage in this way in the first place. We shouldn't allow this conflict to happen in the first place. Now, kind of thought number two. Um, it's okay for this conflict to emerge, right? It's okay for us to um, create this subjective reality by bringing something into the world that wasn't there. Um, and when the third person enters the scene, we should fill them in on what's actually going on in air quotes. Um, you know, of course, we acknowledge that there are two kind of different realities going on, and we fill the person who's entering the scene in as they enter the scene. So, in this context, either the players or if you have your invisible floating GM, whoever, as the third player enters the scene, would kind of fill them in. We're pushing a rock, and then once that is made clear, right? Then you've kind of caught the third person up. Um, this sort of, I suppose the strengths of this kind of process is that, well, you can have your world, you can fill in details as you go with kind of improvisation and theater of the mind. But then you can still catch people up and have everybody on the same page as they enter the scene. The downside is you need somebody there to catch the person up. Imagine that the two people who are pushing the boulder in front of the door have now left, and the GM has also now left, and the third person, as you said in your example, right? The third person walks through the door, only to later find out that there was supposed to be a barricade or something in front of the door, and they shouldn't have been able to go through it. Um, so this sort of system, this sort of thought process, can fail if there isn't someone around or there isn't something around to tell the person who's entering the scene that they're missing some information. Um, and this can become if this is the only thing that you rely upon, this can become a pretty big problem, as you'll end up with a bunch of different time-sensitive scenes happening, and you'll still end up with disconnects in your reality, even though you're trying to not. Um, Kind of like camp number 3, I would say, is, well, what if it's just okay? What if it's just okay to have different people uh, experiencing different things? Um, it's okay. We don't have to catch people up. We kind of trust that everybody's here to kind of build to, a fulfilling and coherent story, and we'll do our best to deal with conflicts as they arise. Um, I'm actually a pretty big fan of this. I've been doing lots of improv. Um, Got to participate in a bit of like narrative improv stuff or and long form stuff as well. And there, right, this is kind of like the improv approach of like, you establish things, and if you mess up and you establish something that conflicts with information that came previously, that's okay. Somebody just gives, somebody just lets go, and you just go with the new thing that's been established, or you go and you don't really feel the need to correct somebody. So, and under this line of thought, you could have the two people start miming that they're pushing a boulder. The third person comes in and is like, "Oh, you're pushing a cabinet or something," and that's fine, right? And you don't need to aggressively correct the third person because they've got the gist of what's going on, right? Um, Unless there is some, other reason why it's really important that it's a boulder, unless it's really, really, really important for some reason that it's a boulder, the third person has the gist of what's going on, right? And you've gotten the important details, and that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Under the kind of the third school of thought. Um, this one is, in my opinion, I really enjoy doing this thing. I'm very comfortable with different things being true at the same time. But I will say it is kind of hard. It is hard to, as like a player in this context. It is really difficult.
Yeah.
And like, I've been practicing improv for a while, and like, it's just hard, right? It's hard to occupy. It requires that every player kind of be at the top of their intelligence and be paying attention and be like thinking about their actions like all the time if you go fully in this direction.
And I would say,
Um,
even in the opposite direction, like not allowing for that flexibility means you still have to be on top of your shit all the time, understanding what's going on in its complete, entire truth as it exists before you've even perceived it, which means you've got to check in on like, asking a GM for things and whatever, and that can be quite a bit too. Which for me is why this principle and myself and you too heavily leaned in the third option, right? Because
mhm,
the idea that different things can exist at the same time is totally fine as long as they're able to reconcile those in the moment. Uh, so for example, the person gets in to the house and later learns they couldn't. Uh, as a third person, I can think, well, how do I make sense of this, right? If there was something in front of the door, maybe I could have squeezed under it. Maybe I broke in, and now suddenly there's a conflict in this scene.
mhm.
If it makes sense that I would have broken in, and waffle around a little bit and be like, well, I found a way in, and suddenly something happens, right? Something's interesting. So the skill of being able to figure out how to reconcile that in the moment. We talked about that last episode. It's very it's not easy. But this is a developed skill. This is something that takes time
Mhm.
to understand how to do properly. But it is very useful both in the shared truth context and also just determining truth, right? Since we have this pattern of saying, at this point you can consider two things to be true at the same time, then it kind of falls upon us as the players to at some point in real time understand what's going on in the scene if we have those conflicts.
I will very quickly differentiate because I guess that the last conversation, I will very quickly differentiate between person coming into the scene being the person who describes or defines what's going on versus it just being totally okay that the the people in the scene and the people coming into the scene just have a different perspective, right? Where it's like we acknowledge the conflict and then let it go, and don't necessarily feel the need to fix it, right? In actually like more relevant to improv, like I guess what I was describing. Usually, it's the whoever was last, whoever like evidenced the thing last, kind of gets to define what like the actual reality of the scene. Um, and there's this can also work where it's like the person entering the scene is the one who kind of like spikes the volleyball and determines what's actually going on. That happens a lot in improv, but also something that um but in the improv context, and the thing that improv doesn't have that roleplay does is multiple scenes going on at once. So you can still there kind of hang on to this idea of like having one objective truth. And I think where roleplay differs is when you have more than one scene going on at a time. Um, it kind of like the concept of having a like one true objective truth kind of is just like
It melts, right?
it's like almost it's like almost hopeless. um it's pretty hopeless, and the more people you have and the more scenes are going at once, the more hopeless it becomes. And in that case, like personally, I am in the camp of just like it's okay, you gotta chill out. If it's easy, right? If it's something that's like really easy to establish, like if you can really easily establish an objective truth, go for it, right? But you don't have to make a huge deal out of like every small discrepancy that arises, right? If it's like a small discrepancy and it doesn't matter, then like you don't have to waste your time establishing trying to desperately establish a truth for something that is not very consequential, right? And it's you can just kind of sit back and let go and be okay with the fact that two different people have different interpretations of what happened.
Right. To which one might think, but Solus, but Scyllin, what? Wow, my words just completely left me there. Let me try that again. But how do we keep things together in that case? How do we have a central idea that we can all kind of play around? Oh, look at that central idea themes.
Themes.
Maybe that's the exact core that we are looking for here. So if we are effectively saying different things can be true at the same time and people can perceive things differently and actually reconcile that those may not be as consequential to the story, then what's the breaking point? And the breaking point is generally very, very, very hard to reach as long as we well define and share and agree upon the themes that we're aiming for. But basically, the breaking point ends up being at the point where either we are dying on a hill we shouldn't, or we are effectively playing against the themes that we have already agreed to share. And that's how we kind of keep everything together, right? If we have a shared subject or idea that we're already kind of playing toward, then regardless of the small amounts of times where we might say, oh well, the objective truth is kind of like, fizzled out a little bit over here, it's fine because we're still working in the same direction. And that's kind of the core of it, right? The core is still themes. We are still very heavily playing toward that angle of building and building toward and building around maintaining themes. So this is actually very fine. It actually still works. God, I love
Mm.
themes.
Yeah, and I guess in this context, right, it's essentially the idea is, right, that it's more important that you're telling a story than it is that you're telling, the story, right?
Yeah.
Um, because it can just be really difficult, right? If you want to tell one and only one story in the context of a role play, that can be really difficult to do. And I don't know, I feel like it really is kind of like in a sense, I feel like it's like a waste of time to make sure that you're telling one and only one story. I personally feel like that's a waste of time. What I think is much more practical is that you want to make sure that every person in the role play is telling, a story, their story, and they're kind of working together so that everybody has a story to tell. Um, and as long as you're all working towards that same goal, the discrepancies, I personally don't think matter all that much.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, like, if obviously you want to keep things from drifting too far apart that, people aren't able to tell, like, if people aren't able to work together because things have drifted that far apart, like, you still want to avoid that situation, right? But I guess that's what themes are for, you know?
Exactly. So we've talked a lot about discrepancy here, action versus perception, and I kind of want to dive into each of those, right? Let's actually we said we have it perceiver and then actor as in our planning. Let's do actor first because I think we've actually said more relevant things to. I think it's a better transition here. So like we're gonna kind of look at one versus the other, right? We're gonna look now at the person who is acting out certain things and what that might look like, right? Now, in the example that Selin just brought up, these two people, us two, pushing the boulder. The third person gets a lot of information from this scene for one very specific reason: physical acting, right? Maybe we're like labored grunts, right? Just ugh, God, this is heavy, right? Like the voice acting helps too, right? The physical and voice acting aspect of this real time medium is insanely powerful. It is exactly what helps us communicate all of these things so that they're easily perceivable. And if we are in this kind of mindset of like comparing contrasting things, right? You can compare to like someone who does neither of those two. They kind of just sit around and they might just say the things that they expect to happen very uh, maybe they don't like differentiate in any way between being distressed or tired or angry or happy versus like neutral voice, then they've effectively offered no way for people to perceive things. It is absolutely the goal, or should be the goal of an actor of any kind, to make it very obvious what is going on at a glance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like from the perception of someone coming into a scene, it's harder to engage with a scene if you have to enter it and then talk to people for like several minutes to even understand what's going on in it. It helps much more if you are able to sit upon the sidelines for a bit, watch what's going on, and immediately get a grasp of, okay, these two people are trying to push something out of the way of a door because they need to get in, or maybe because they own the place, maybe the details I would need to figure out, but the general gist of it, what's going on here, I understand it because I see these people and what they're doing and what they're sounding out. And we have all that power in VR. We have the ability to physically act and to voice act, very much like standard LARP. So we have exactly that level of capability.
Mm-hmm. All right, Solace, I have a question.
I might have an answer.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm entirely on board. I personally like when I think of acting in the context of roleplay, right? Like roleplay is not roleplay isn't acting, but acting is one of the tools. Like as a role player, acting is one of your tools for communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially like physical acting, voice acting, and all this stuff. The whole reason that we act is to convey information beyond the words that the character is saying, right? That's the whole point. If you didn't have any other information to convey, then you wouldn't need to act. But there's a lot of stuff that you want to be able to convey this extra information about the world, about like emotions, about like maybe even your plans as a player out of character. You might convey that through your acting,
Mm.
and yeah, and that's what I think that acting is for, in a roleplay context, is like a form of communication.
Yeah.
Um, and that's all well and great. It's all well and great when if you've kind of like practiced acting, and you're good at conveying information through your acting and your physical acting. That's all well and good. But here we were just talking about acting versus just telling people what to do, right? Whereas instead of telling someone we're pushing this boulder, you act it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, the acting is the acting does create more ambiguity, right? In a sense, and you're conveying a lot of information, right? But if you're not doing it very carefully and you're not doing it well, I'll define good acting here, by the way, as
Sure.
like conveying information well. I don't care about like things like being able to do voices or like emotions like realistically. I could care less. I'm going to define good acting in a roleplay context as like being able to effectively communicate information through it, right? That's how I will be using the term good acting here. A bit different than you would think of in like movies or something, right? Um, in in that context, right? Well, what if you have, let's ask kind of like an accessibility question. Let's say you have somebody who's kind of like newish, or like maybe not that good at acting, not that good at conveying information through their acting. Um, what do they do? Right? What do they do? Because if I feel like that's like a big part of it, where if I don't feel confident that I can convey what I'm doing through my acting, right? Maybe I'm not confident that I can convey that I'm pushing something, or I'm not confident that I can convey that, my character is feeling this emotion, or if I'm not confident that I can convey this, then, it's pretty tempting to kind of just go and say, in short, succinct narration, this is what's happening.
Sure.
Where's the balance kind of like between these two ideas? Because if the goal is to convey information, right, and acting is a skill that I have not yet developed to the point that I can convey the information that I want to convey, what do I do
Still do it.
as the actor?
I would say still do it. I genuinely believe there's not very much of a balance between the two. I think it is genuinely almost always better to attempt to act it out, even if you feel you're not up to par with it, because the more you practice it, the more you kind of learn how to do it and get the hang of it, the easier it is and the better you are at it, right? This is something that is built over time. It's not, immediate. No one's, it's very rare to find someone who's like just going to come in and just be a superstar at acting out literally everything all at once. This is something that people develop over time, right? And because it's a developed skill, it only develops when you're actually using it, when you're actually practicing it, and when you're actually looking for opportunities to practice it. So I would say look for those opportunities and these situations where you have been confronted with an opportunity to evidence something about whatever your character's doing or an emotion of your character, then like put in the attempt to like actually do it, even if you think it's like not good enough, quote unquote, because anything is better than nothing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's about where I fall. I mean, I do think like I do think that that's probably the correct thing to do, right? Like we're not here to kind of like judge people's skill. I think that that's kind of like a really important thing. Like I think someone who's trying and doing their best is perfectly fine. I did kind of want to give advice to that person though, Bill, because like
Sure.
just do it is in my experience like yeah, it's true, but it's also like not the advice that you want to hear. Like,
Yeah, that's fair.
you know, it's like not really advice on like how to do it,
Yeah,
right?
it's not helpful.
Um, like on one hand, it's literally true. On the other hand, it's not very helpful. Um, and like I think that I think that like you've actually kind of like given this advice in the past. I think like a good bridge between like acting and narration is dialogue. Um, I believe you've explicitly given this advice in the past, where imagine like character comes over and is like trying to hand another character some invisible flowers,
Mhm.
and you could say like I could narrate this exchange, right? I could be like, you see, she has some purple flowers in her hands or something, right? I could narrate this situation. Alternatively, I could say, hey Solus, here's some violets, and then like hand them over to you, right? I've like said this in words, right? I've said explicitly what I'm doing in words, but through my character, right?
Right.
Um, I haven't really had to do any acting. Um, or like it's literally words, but I haven't had to like break outside of my character. It's something that you can communicate through words without having to rely on other forms of acting. So, and I think that holds true for a lot of things. I think like you might end up having some like silly and maybe like unnatural sounding dialogue if you rely too heavily on this method, right? But I think that's kind of like the first step, that's like step one is to move away from narration and use dialogue, and then step two would be to like move away from the dialogue into like more physical acting. And of course, at the end of the day, you'll probably be using a mix of dialogue and physical acting. It's not like you want to have no dialogue,
Right. Right. Right.
but I think a lot of the narration can be simply replaced, probably like most of it, right? Like 99% of the narration can be replaced with dialogue without too much effort, right? You're going to be saying the same things just as your character rather than not.
Yeah. That's a good piece of advice. Like, focus on one part at a time.
Mm.
And I will say, like, it is also possible to like shift the order around a little bit. I think the dialogue is a good first step for sure. I think like physical and voice acting can come in any order after that, depending on
Hmm.
what the people are good at. Because I'm like a very expressive talker. I'll use gestures. Like I'll move my hands as I talk and kind of move myself. Upper chest, kind of step around. I'm very expressive. So like for me, physical acting was like the number one thing I wanted to focus on first.
Hmm.
Is like how to portray things as realistic as possible. Once again, kind of just looking back at our diegesis episode, right? We talked a lot about like how to make things real. That's one way, right? We kind of, we can walk around, we can kind of turn on a foot, and we can make things look as real as possible. When it comes to reality and communicating it, that also kind of plays a part too, right? If we want to show that our character's angry, we have our we can say exactly what would convey that. We can, you know, pump our fists in front of us and like lean into the conversation physically. That further sells it. We can raise our voice. We can kind of say things more abruptly. That also leans into it, right? These are ways to in a very core acting sense try to convey uh, realities of a scene
Hmm.
in such a way that other people have a much easier time of perceiving it. If I'm doing all these things and I'm supporting that this character is angry and what they're angry about in the most ways that I can, then it's very easy for someone to enter a scene or to be in a scene to see what's going on and say, oh, that character's really angry. I need to respond to this in XYZ way. And people will share that because most people will reasonably look at that and say, oh, this guy's angry. You know? Like that makes sense. That's part of the scene. And because everyone's perceiving it, then it's a lot more of a shared perspective. And then, the scene continues on a very shared note. Right.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's very fair, and yeah, and I would also like to add though, where it's like I guess the second part of the advice, where it's like in those cases where you feel caught off guard, and you kind of like feel the impulse to narrate something, right, and you're kind of like you don't know what to do, you don't know how to like portray it through other means. Like, in my opinion, just go ahead and do it. Right? Just go ahead, do the narration, keep it short, keep it quick, and then just go back later, right? You can go back later and kind of like think about, why you felt the need to narrate and like,
Mm.
what the purpose of that was, and kind of like think about, well, in the future, if I want to convey this sort of information, how could I do that? It's the same as any skill. You learn in pieces, and like I treat the opportunity, right? I treat these situations where I'm caught off guard and like don't know how to proceed as like an opportunity to figure out the bits that I don't know yet, right? Like this is a piece that I clearly need to practice, right? This is like the thing. And next time it happens, if I think about it a bit, next time it happens, I'll be prepared. It's fine, just let it happen. You don't need to like panic. You just like you can just think about it, and next time you'll be more prepared, basically.
Yeah. And in no cases is this a failure, right? Like
Yeah.
this is there's no failure as long as you're intending and in good faith to play in this medium. You're not failing. You are improving, right?
Hmm.
See every position like this as an opportunity to improve.
Yeah. Um, I do want to feel like we've started with the actor here, but when you say that, when you say improve, I do want to take like a bit of a tangent and talk about why this is improving, right? Like why is it better? Why is it better to we've kind of talked around this, right? We've kind of talked around this, but why is it better to allow the perceiver to interpret what they're seeing? rather than telling them this is what they're seeing.
Well, because this is an
When I
immersive and
say when I
interpretive medium.
Yeah, when I say it like that, it almost feels natural, right? But like I think I think it's important to kind of like think about and relate it back to kind of like when we started, right?
Sure.
Um, if I say it that way, it sounds pretty bad to not do it, right? But remember at the very beginning of this, we kind of like started out with kind of talking about the story and that like surprise twist, right?
Hmm.
Um, where in your head your actions as viewed in your head are different than what the person perceiving you thinks they are, right? And so if you've been going and you've been kind of role playing and you've been acting things out, and now all of a sudden you drop some narration where it's like, I don't know, I feel like I've seen GMs be like very very I've seen GMs do this a couple of times where it's like you see the person getting angry and they seem threatening, right? That's not a universal truth, right? Like, what if I'm playing a character that's like really dense and like doesn't really understand like what's like the whole emotional aspect, and like they can
Hmm.
see that the person's yelling, but they don't perceive that they're angry. Or maybe you're playing like the buff like macho man who's definitely not threatened by this this puny outburst, um telling the other person this is what's happening in unless you're going to do that literally all the time, which I mean that's not very feasible, is going to run into its own conflicts, right? If you take a break um from interpretive, from role play, from the dialogue, which is necessarily interpreted, and then suddenly lay down this is what's happening, that will almost inevitably come into conflict with how others are perceiving it.
I can also imagine it's just a wild, consistently exhausting mental exercise to try to specifically only narrate things that are a matter of fact. Because at that point, like the reason why that failed is because you have effectively assumed common interpretations of the matter of fact that's in front of you. But in reality, if you were to assert a fact about a scene and then just talk about that fact, you would basically just say, this person is having an angry outburst. And how you interpret it after that is up to you as the audience of the thing that is happening. But
Mhm.
then again, it's like at that point there is such a thin veil between what the person needs to do to convey that the person is having an angry outburst versus like the amount of time that it takes for everyone to stop and listen to the person saying as a matter of fact that this person's having an angry outburst, that like this amount of time just seems very poorly spent in comparison. It also takes
Mhm.
away from our ability to actually see the scene and have more time to actually play.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of like reason number one, right? That this is an improvement. Reason number one would be the act of trying to correct the discrepancy often causes another discrepancy, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it is really hard. It would be really, really difficult to only narrate things that are like universally understood, because you don't know what those universally understood things are, because you're not you're one person and you don't know what's going on in everybody else's head. So like you're essentially throwing darts at a dartboard blind, and you may or may not successfully pull it off, right? But you have no idea. Um, that's kind of like reason number one, that it's better to leave things as interpreted, is because trying to correct the discrepancy tends to cause more discrepancies. Now, I'm going to actually offer another like reason number two. Um, I think like theater of the mind is I think a bit has been a bit underutilized in like VR role play.
Hmm.
But I feel like theater of the mind, as much as we like to like evidence things in the world, I think the narrative that's going on inside of a person's head is almost always more flattering and more exciting than what's actually happening. Like, let me tell you, I've watched back like some of my old like combat roleplay stuff, and let me tell you, it just like it just looks cringe. Like I remember like some of them I remember not liking, but others I remember like thoroughly enjoying. But even the ones that I remember thoroughly enjoying, I go back and watch it and it's just I'm just like, what the heck is going on? This is just cringe, you know? Um and I don't find that very surprising because like I think the narrative that's going on inside of your head as a player is always going to be much, much, much more flattering than you know what's actually happening.
Yeah.
Um, when you're in the magic circle, you want to be engaged. You want to be immersed. You want to be pulled into this world. Um, and it's kind of like easy to let yourself go in that. And in this case, I think the subjective reality really like increases people's enjoyment of the thing. Like literally, I think just allowing people to kind of sit and just immerse themselves in their own subjective reality um, will increase those people's immersion. Pulling them out of it, right? Pulling them out of that subjective reality and kind of like reminding them of what's actually going on. I think that kind of like runs the risk of kind of damaging that internal narrative.
Hmm. It's very much like, you could be kind of swinging those VR swords at each other and perceive that there's this kind of epic standoff happening based on like whatever narrative position that you perceived that led up to this point, and also the things, the moments that are happening within it. And if someone kind of comes up to this not knowing any of that context, having their own perception, maybe they've kind of otherwise uneventful session, and they walk up to this and they see this happening, and they just see two people just yelling at each other and kind of swinging and making
Mm-hmm.
like clanging sounds. Yeah, it might look a little cringe from their side too, right? It's like, all of this is subjective, right? These two
Mm-hmm.
people locked in this bout by CS as like the most important thing that's happening right now. And it's this huge, cool sort of moment. And someone could be right next to them thinking, I don't understand what's happening here. This is weird.
Just wow, that looks lame.
Yeah, Liz, this looks weird. This
But
looks lame. And like, surely there's, some way to like at least have people on the same kind of narrative page. But like, even then, like, it is certainly the case that even within a well controlled sort of thematic direction, that you can still have these sort of moments, and that's totally fine, right? It's not everyone needs to be involved in this like big dramatic moment. It's just a matter of understanding, maybe it doesn't have to objectively be a big moment. It can subjectively be a big moment for these two characters, and it's okay that this third character, this third player, doesn't actually have that same understanding of the scene.
Mhm. Yeah, I sorry. I know I kind of like derailed our like actor conversation, but I thought this was really important because like we were talking about
Yeah.
acting and like improving skills and like I've gone on the record kind of like saying that like you don't need to know like you don't need to be a good actor to do role play, right? And I
Hmm.
think like I think that's true. I also think it's true that if you want to do role play, you do have to engage with like some amount of acting. It doesn't need to be air quotes good, whatever that means. Um, it's just the fact that you're engaging with acting in the first place rather than narration, right? Um, is what matters. Not so much like whatever subjective quality that you assign to that acting, right?
Yeah.
Because specifically because if you're engaging with acting in the first place, then you allow the other person to interpret what you're doing, which means you allow them to have this cool narrative in their head, right? Rather than if you're narrating at them, then you're not allowing them to have this cool narrative in their head, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's really the only difference. So it's not about any subjective quality of the acting. It's just the fact that the acting is happening, period. That's important.
Yeah, I would absolutely go on the record, as I have in our conversations before, Selwyn, to say that being a good voice actor, physical actor, does not make you a good role player automatically. It
Yeah.
absolutely does not. There is such a broad skill set of being a role player that is absolutely not covered by just saying things in a way that better
Mhm.
portrays certain scenes and emotions. No, there's so much more to consider as a role player. There's a lot more.
Yeah. And it certainly helps, right? Like
Oh yeah,
acting as a skill certainly helps you communicate information more effectively, right? And
yeah,
that's as long as you're doing that, as long as you're doing that in a way that's not, you know, dictation, you're you're perfectly fine. However that way may be.
yeah.
Um, Acting is certainly one of those ways, though. So, you know, that
Right,
definitely don't sleep on that.
exactly. So I'm gonna move a bit forward here to talk about VR once again. We want to kind of maximize the potential of this space, right? And thinking about this kind of links back once again to the diegesis conversation, but what we can do in VR transcends what is possible to portray in real life. Like, once again, going back to the fireball example, I could just sit there and mime out throwing things and then just yell fireball in my IRL LARP. And it's a bit cringe because, like, nothing's really happening and you have to just assume that everyone's supposed to kind of see and hear this thing. But we can do that in VR, right? We can have the effect of seeing a fireball happen and being able to react to it, because obviously we're seeing and hearing it. So we once again look at the strengths of VR and our abilities to uh, portray all of the things that we want to show, and to tie it back into this concept. Uh, because reality is based on perception, we want to have others perceive the things we want to be real, right? So if I have a character that I want to show is powerful to some degree, right? Like magically powerful. The way I might do that is I have some sort of aura, maybe, or like I kind of create this big effect around them, like things kind of pushing away, wind, generating some sort of like wind or whatever, and I can do all of that. I don't need to like mime any of that out, so I can make that real. I can basically access another vector of creating reality for others, and that's the important part, right? For others, because otherwise I could just say this person's powerful and just kind of yell about it. But it ain't real for them until they in some way see it. This is why you have those like moments in these like either animes or uh, Hollywood shows or whatever where they find ways to show these things instead of say it, and how how to portray that is kind of an art in and of itself, right? Like the different kinds of effects you can use, the uh, the different kinds of like audios that help push these kinds of ideas along. I just kind of a study in and of itself, right? So I just kind of wanted to riff on that a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I think like VR with like the avatars, and in this context, I think it's just like mostly avatars. Like we're talking about the actor and therefore like the person themselves portraying their character, right?
Yeah.
So in this context, it's mostly avatars, but to a lesser extent, the worlds as well. We can portray a lot of things.
Yeah.
A lot of things that would otherwise just not be not be possible.
I mean,
Um,
I wanna bring up an example here. Think this is practical. This is very practical. I mean, think about it this way, right? There are a ton of people who put blood toggles on their avatars,
mhm.
and why is that, right? Because it doesn't it doesn't change much about how they play, right? Because they are effectively actually inconveniencing themselves by having to put on this toggle that effectively signals to everyone else that this person is in some way damaged. But that latter part of the last phrase I just said kind of clues you in on it, right? They are signaling to other people that they are harmed in some way, right? They are making it real for other people. It's visual signal, right? So it's sure it could absolutely help if they're kind of like looking at their own arm and they see like the streaks of blood and whatever, but it absolutely helps other people more than anything because you could limp around all you want, but what makes it so much more real is that like consistent visual indicator that once again it becomes way easier for the person to perceive and understand what the context of the scene is if they can see the damage on the avatar itself kind of decaled on there.
Oh God, I remember I once had I once put a blood toggle on my avatar, and was like, I just enabled it and then was halfway through the in character date before the other. I guess in this case, Panda noticed. That was really fun. Right, I didn't need to say anything. Right, I just kind of had the blood toggle on. It was like really subtle. It wasn't like a really like super like big splatters of blood. It was just like more like a couple of like flecks here and there. We were like halfway through the date, but he brings it up. He's like, "Is that blood?" I'm like, "Yeah." And I think like that was a really fun thing, and I feel like it would have been significantly less fun, right, if it was like you notice suddenly that like I feel like that would have been significantly less fun.
You know, there's something I realized I forgot to talk about when it comes to like the narrating you notice XYZ is that like it kind of puts the social pressure to react to it, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Because it's like I have told you, I've gone out of my way to tell you about this particular aspect that I want you to see in this scene, and I have stopped your roleplay to tell you this. So what are you gonna do? Stares in your eyes, like right? The pressure to like actually react to it is pretty high, and once again, like I think even without assuming any sort of like interpretation, this does kind of assume an intention, and it assumes that this detail is important to notice to the other person. When again, that might not be the case. I might be playing a character that at that point in time does not care that this person's having an angry outburst and would just ignore that and walk right on by. But by stopping me and telling me that this person's having an angry outburst and that I notice it, then like the social pressure to do something in response to that is really really high. I think this is something that we've all experienced to some degree by being in one of those situations that you feel like you have to react to it in some capacity because it's effectively being assumed that this thing is important to your character when in reality not always.
Yeah, and in that context, it does go beyond just the literal facts of the scene. It definitely does have a bit of that tied along in it. I suppose unless you kind of like discuss these things amongst your players like ahead of time, right? in that like this is like an actual mechanic in the role play. I've never seen any role play do this, right? By the way, but
Mhm.
like I could theoretically see like a you notice mechanic where like it's very clear that like you don't have to react to it. I've never seen that discussion take place though. Like I think this is the first time like you're catching me off guard here, right? Like I I've never seen anybody treat it in that way where it's like explicitly optional. And I think if it's not explicitly optional, then it absolutely does carry that social pressure of like, hey, here's this thing that you notice, wink wink, you know? And like the real reason that I'm bringing it up is because I want you to react to it, right? Like here's the thing, I'm giving it to you and I want you to react to it, right? Especially because like, like in that context, like I've absolutely now that I bring this up, I've absolutely seen the flip side where like some people get the you notice and then other people don't. Later
Mm.
when I don't feel like I've like pulled the you notice on like three people, but the fourth person doesn't get it because I don't feel like doing the scene a fourth time. You know, um, and so I just don't have to evidence it anymore, right? Um,
Yeah.
I've definitely seen that used in that way. But yeah, it's like and for this reason, I think I'll actually expand. I will actually expand the definition here from narration to like dictation, in the context of like I think it's narration is like the verbal mode of dictation, right? Like that's the way that you get what you want like verbally, but I think there are other methods of dictation as well. I can think back to a specific kind of like scene that I had in like a combat role play once. And this was like 3 years ago, so like, it's like whatever. But like I do remember being in like a very specific scene where like we were NPCing in this context, and the other character had a sword, and every single swing that they did was explicitly either a unambiguously either a uh, decapitation blow, like specifically like swinging through the other person's head, or stab through the gut, like twist the blade and like show that it gets stuck and then pull it out, right? Um, and like I feel like that experience was like I like look back at that, and that's like what I usually use as an example of like dictation through like physical acting, because the player wasn't saying that you're dead, but like there was absolutely no room for ambiguity, right? Where it's like, okay, we're we're playing humans. You have a big sword, and you stab in my gut, and you make a show of like twisting the blade and it getting stuck, right? Like there is only one way to interpret that, right? Uh, in that there's only one reasonable way to interpret that, right? I could ignore, right? I could ignore it and just like do the whole RP dodge thing, right? But I think it is also possible to dictate non-verbally. I think it's harder to dictate non-verbally,
Mhm.
but I think it is possible to dictate non-verbally. Um, so really, that's what I think here is the more important thing to think about, is like, why are you doing something? Am I doing something because I want to force a specific outcome?
Yeah.
Um, right.
That's a
Um,
tough one for me to comment on because I know this would like tie into like a very long conversation about combat and sound effects
yeah, it's
because
it's it's hard.
yeah, it's there are several ways to react to things, but it is in some cases much easier to portray a combat scene when you don't have two people that are initiators, and then on top of that, this initiator can tend to, in good faith, effectively say things that happen by just kind of acting them out, making the sound effects, like the very like power gamey sort of example being swinging the sword through someone's neck and making a squelching sound, right? Like this hit, this went through, that it's bad, right? Like that's
Mhm.
the obvious like, man, this fucking
Yeah.
sucks sort of
And
example.
like mind you, like I would be perfectly like open to like if I'm going to be right the the non-player character in this situation, right? Like I am there to kind of like play the other person up, right? Like I will kind of like throw open my guard and be like, you know, showing the other person like, come stab me, right? Like I can do that, right? Like we can absolutely do that. I guess this is why like I prefer the sort of defender oriented like combat where it's like you have like a two-way conversation and like people can interpret things one way or another, and like it's a back and forth rather
Mhm.
than one person taking it upon themselves to be like, okay, well, here's exactly what happens, and I'm going to like cover all the bases and make sure that there's only one like reasonable interpretation of the events. Um, right? I think like in that in that situation, right? Like the outcome that actually matters, right, is like character A wins the fight is more important than saying that like in this moment, in this exact moment, character A has successfully, decapitated the other character, right? Like adding on those details and forcing the other person to do things the one way kind does in fact, take the other person out of what they're doing. And that's the experience that I had, right, where I was really taken out of that combat roleplay. Not once again, not that I like combat roleplay too much, but like it can be fun. Um, but that I remember as like a specific instance of like we're just really being taken out of it, right?
Mhm.
Um, with that, what I will now call nonverbal dictation. Uh, I haven't seen that very often, mind you, but I think it definitely does happen.
Mhm. I've actually seen it quite a bit. Not as egregious by any means, but it's certainly like it is one of those things that like it is required to be managed in some way, shape, or form. And I think as long as people are playing in good faith,
Mhm.
it's like somewhat fine to have those in combat, but it's just a matter of like managing them.
Yeah.
That's a whole other
I, I'm
conversation.
I'm I'm not, I'm not just thinking about combat here. I'm thinking about like elsewhere as well.
Sure, yeah,
Um, I feel like it's in general like over the course, right? Like I feel like in non-combat situations, you usually just get narration.
yeah,
Um, most of the time, I think usually just get narration. So I think narration is much more widespread. But really, it doesn't matter, right? Like verbal, not verbal. I don't think it really matters. I think the core part here is that dictation, right? Where it's like
hmm,
as the actor, I am telling the other person what they see, whether it be verbally or non-verbally, right?
yeah,
Rather than communicating my ideas, I am telling you exactly what you see and what you should do. uh it's like a different vibe to it, right?
yeah. I get what you mean.
And it's more it's a lot harder to kind of like point out with nonverbal stuff, but I think it definitely exists.
Hmm. So here's a big topic. Then we're gonna move a bit forward here. Um, so let's say I have a character that has something hidden about them. They are either hiding something willingly or they maybe unwillingly have effectively hidden some sort of aspect that's actually interesting to the narrative of the people around them or the setting at large. Um, so if they don't present it, is it real to anyone else? It's kind of an alley oop.
No.
Yeah, exactly. So
No.
this is where we effectively say, I will say this with about as much strength as it comes. Um, your backstory doesn't matter unless you evidence it somehow, right? There's a big unless. If you choose not to show anything about your backstory and to hold it as a secret, we'll talk about secrets next episode, then effectively it does not matter at all, because it isn't real to anyone else. It's just
Doesn't
this
matter until you show it.
exactly. So you have this is absolutely where we say from an acting perspective, from a role player's perspective. I'm going to switch my terminology here. I've been using actor too much. From a role player's perspective, your one of your jobs is to effectively show all of the things that you have built in some way, shape, or form. But then you might say, but Solus, what if my character wants to hide something? Well, how do we do that? Right? What do you think?
See, I think this is I'm going to talk from the I'm going to talk from this perspective of the sort of role play that I want here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are certainly like lots of different types of role plays where like like if you're doing secrets and powers, you might have like certain mechanics to that. Um, you might actually have like certain mechanics to secrets. Um, but let's say we don't. Let's say we don't, and we're in the sort of like player's choice. I have some backstory secret that I want to come out eventually, right? Um, I think if you're hiding information, you should do it badly. You should do it badly enough that everyone around you knows that you're trying to hide a secret,
Mm-hmm.
and simply trust that the players around you will understand that, hey, you're trying to, hide a secret, and kind of come to that conclusion, and potentially respect that and potentially disrespect that later, like allow the people around you to kind of choose whether or not um, they pick up on it, right?
Yeah.
And there's a this is a big like trust situation, right? Because doing that opens up to opens up the door to the one person across from you being like, oh, you just revealed your big secret, and then going around and telling everybody, right? um so that's like a you're trusting that your co-players won't do that, right? um
Right.
but I don't know. I think you should be able to. I think you should be able to trust your co-players that they don't go and do that, right? um or at least if they're gonna go and do that, right? Like maybe wait a bit, maybe wait like, I don't know, a little bit before doing that.
Yeah, stew in the conflict, right? Like if you do effectively get clued in by this player effectively revealing that they have some big secret and like what it's kind of like in line with, then maybe you could like kind of build that up by like starting to express some distrust between the characters. Like, I don't know if I trust this guy very much anymore.
Hmm.
Like you could effectively build it up and kind of ramp up this tension that this character has effectively made by saying they've got something else going on, and knowing their direction as they're communicating to you, you communicate it back to them. You start to like react in ways that show that you're distrusting, and not try to hide it, but show it. And the
Yeah.
moment you start showing it more, you are making it real for the other person that this conflict is bi-directional and probably omnidirectional, depending on how many other people are involved. The more that the player sees, the more they can react to, and the more they can build on, which just makes it better.
Yeah. The relationship that absolutely does not have to flip on a dime. Like, it's something that you as a player can kind of like steer a bit.
Mm-hmm.
um but yeah, I think from the actor's perspective though, like, if you have, your secret backstory, I am very much of the belief that you should be a poor keeper of those secrets. Because if you're
Mm-hmm.
not a poor keeper of those secrets, then those secrets don't exist. And like you're in this role play and like 3 months pass and like you have it in your backstory that like you're like secretly like a spy and have like elite military training, but you've been playing this character like as a complete airhead and like not done anything whatsoever. Then like 3 months down the line, right, you like completely flip and are like, okay, well actually I have these like I have this like secret military training or something, right? um that's gonna feel like it's come out of nowhere because it has come out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
You've For all the other players know, you could have just written that into your backstory like 2 seconds ago, right? Like you've literally just pulled it out of nowhere, right? For all anybody else knows. And I think it's important to consider that perspective because you've kind of just hit everybody else in that scene with just a huge amount of cognitive dissonance. Um, and that kind of sucks. Like to be on the receiving end of.
Yeah.
So
It also sucks on like the acting end because like if you do want to like blindside a whole bunch of people with this like cool knowledge of I'm the spy and I've been playing against you guys all along, then you kind of want everyone to be involved and to react to that properly. Because then that if it's important to them and there's this big reveal and it happens, then you get to feel better about all the shock value of like, whoa, this actually happened. This is crazy and how it happened and unfolded in this cool way. So then the more you bring people in on it, the better of an experience you have when the big reveal happens, right? I do see Derpy. I do see the comment in the chat. I will get to that in just a moment. I do want to get to this example that this is very much the like neon divide like decking sort of issue, right? Where you would basically have like one player off in a different map kind of like set up this thing where they're like spying on some sort of camera in an arena or something, and then like this player like three sessions later goes into the arena, has a conversation, leaves, nothing happens in their scene besides them having the conversation, and then this player that was off in a different map spying on them gets all this information, builds up on it with other players besides the person they're targeting for like another 3 sessions. And then at some point, suddenly, there's a gunfight because of this information. How did this all happen? Well, from the perspective of someone in the arena that just went to have a conversation 3 episodes ago, they don't fucking know, right? It's like, I smelled the sweat of your ass as you lifted yourself off the seat a month ago, and now I have your DNA. And it's like, how how is this possibly like this is not giving the person anyone to work with, right? The reason why I call it the neon divide issue is because like is this having a sort of like decking and sabotage centric sort of play effectively creates a lot of these scenarios where people act on their own to gain information to play against others without coordinating with them or without evidencing it with them because it's indirect, right? And I thought that was very problematic. Uh, I don't have like a solution ready in my mind, but it's something that is like very clear and present to talk about as like this was a problem and this may continue to be a problem with the same patterns because again, without any sort of evidencing for someone to understand that they are progressing through someone else's conflict state, that they effectively don't have the reality of they have been spied on and there is activity leaning toward their character being potentially killed in lethal action. So it's
so
not real.
I I have a thing, right? And this is like I think I've actually talked about this on this podcast. Um,
Sure.
I have a bit of a story from Worlds Apart and like GMing. It was one of my favorite scenes that I helped put on, and I think it kind of ties into like what Derpy is saying there. You know, keeping and revealing secrets may require coordination with the GMs. I'm going to like disagree with that on like a not with the concept of coordinating with the GMs. I'm going to disagree with the require part. But at the same time, I'm going to say like I think coordinating with GMs is like a great thing to do, right? Like I think
Hmm.
GMs can absolutely help you with the keeping secrets. And like this is I guess this is where the story comes in, right? I'll disagree with the require, but um agree with, you know, all the rest of it. Um and okay, so Worlds Apart, we have Brendavir, kind of like very sus snow elf. He's kind of he was basically a spy. Like, you know, he's kind of doing that. Um, and I get a ping from Darth. He's playing Brendavir. He's like, can I sneak up to the shrine? Like, can I use my like I don't know like wind magic? I think it was he was asking like if he could use like wind magic to like make the other people like not hear his footsteps. I'm sitting there. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. But what I can do for you, right? Like I'm not going to go over there and narrate to the people that they don't hear your footsteps, which they already don't hear because you're in VR and you don't have footstep noises. Um, you know? But what I can do for you is I can help you sneak up to that, you know, to the shrine and like listen into the conversation. And so what we proceeded to do is like the two of us kind of like played a game where I was like spotting for them and essentially like got them into the position where they were like underneath the shrine, like Metal Gear Solid, and like listening to this secret conversation that was happening. And you know, I was GMing in Worlds Apart. I was GMing kind of under the assumption that this was like one of the big assumptions that we approached uh GMing in Worlds Apart with, where it was like I trust my players that they're there to be good and be helpful. So I got them into position, and then I kind of just like left them there. And I would come back and check up, you know, every once in a while to just see how like things were progressing. And I was really happy to see that later into the scene, like as it was progressing, what Darth ended up doing is they snuck back out the way that they came, turned around, and came right down the main path and like walked straight into the shrine. Um, Played dumb for all of like 5 seconds before revealing that they were there the whole time and listening in, and it was just great.
Mm. I didn't know that last part
They could
happened.
have walked away, you know, they could have walked away and like not, and the others would have been none the wiser. They would have no idea that they were spied on. Um, you know, like they could have done that, but what they chose to do instead was to just go and let them know. I heard it all, you know.
Yeah.
Um, it was a really cool scene.
It's also a really cool picture that was passed around of the like side view of Brendavir under the walkway while the two people were talking.
Let me go find that. I did take that picture. I actually didn't take a screenshot because I was like I was also in full like, you know, stealth mode, and like, you know, the VR chat camera like makes a sound. So I actually just took a picture from the recording rather than using the camera. Um I really wanted to take a picture, but like in that scene I felt like it wasn't the right thing to do. So it's like really low quality, um but I was really happy to see that, you know, at the end of that, right? At the end of the sneaking, they went right in and just revealed that they were there the whole time. And it was great. It was a great scene. And like that is, evidencing, that is evidencing the secret, right? Like, it would not have been, it would not have been real unless they did that. And so I was really happy to see that they did in fact do it. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. I didn't know that last part happened. I I thought otherwise because like every time I mentioned to Darth that his character was super sus, even though like he would walk around with a mask and dodge every single question about himself, he would then like complain about people thinking he's sus, and I'm like, but that's what you're doing, right? It's like it's there. It's the character's like not insanely great at what he's trying to do, and that's perfectly fine. That's really good. That it's like, isn't that what you're going for? I'm confused. That was the only part that really confused me. Besides that, like
I
the
see.
character doing the things he does. I never really interact with most of it, so a lot of it wasn't real for me. Like I
Hmm.
never saw any of like the espionage or interacted with any of it. So a lot of that, in the language of this, in the language of this principle, a lot of it was just not real for me at all.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
and I think that's fair. Like, there are different perspectives of the same character. But
yeah,
yeah, that was like one of my favorite scenes to put on because it's just like it just went perfectly. Like you had both, right? You had like I don't know, like I feel like you had like the actual stealth role play, right? Like that is like what the sort of stealth role play is all about. Like we had that, and you also had the drama, and you also had like you had everything. There was no compromise, and so
hell yeah,
like um that's why I really liked it because having that secrecy did not come at the cost of like leaving people out of the loop. Like
right.
you can just have both. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, it's one thing to leave characters out of the loop. It's another thing to leave players out of the loop. Right. Totally different things. To comment my own perspective about the question or the comment itself, keeping or revealing secrets may require coordination with GMs. I am I am I am pretty much in agreement with Scylla here. I do believe it is not required by any means. I push even further to say that it often does not require GMs at all. But again, coordinating with GMs who have sort of a broader perspective on multiple different perceptions of the roleplay, having kind of hopped around and seen a bunch of things, even though we have said before that GMs are even less equipped than players to perceive certain things, they're also, working with a lot of different players and hopping around in different places and such. So
I
it
think
is easier to work with them.
this is like the opposite though because like I think what we were talking about, right? We were talking about scenes, right? And like an ongoing scene, I feel like a GM is less equipped to deal with an
Yeah, yeah,
ongoing scene. But like with something like a character keeping a secret, that's more like a narrative thing that's going to affect multiple scenes like over time, right? That's like more of like a large, like a longer and like larger scale thing,
right.
and like having that oversight, the oversight of a GM, I think like in that case, absolutely, I think the GM is better equipped to deal with that sort of thing from like a broad perspective, right? The individual scenes, absolutely not, right? But like the broad like story perspective of like, hey, it might be good to like nudge things in this direction, right? You might like, I don't know, or you might have like a GM might be able to comment on like how you go about like revealing your secret in like the most impactful way, right? Like
Hmm.
that feels like a thing that a GM could help you with,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
With their broader perspective.
Yeah. Or the GM could say something like that. This is like assuming you're in the context of like you are talking things out with a GM, most likely out of character, maybe like between sessions, saying what makes sense to do with this thing that I'm going for. And I would even say like there's a very large opportunity for the GM to even say, I don't think that should be a secret at all. I think that's something you could absolutely talk about and make a very apparent part of your character. I think that kind of conversation alone should be very empowered because I think genuinely people are afraid to say that you can't have those secrets. It's like the denial part of kind of aspect of like, well, if I as the hopeful player within this roleplay submit a character that says, "Oh, there's this cool and interesting thing about them that I don't want to talk about until the time is right," and then as the GM, you then say, "Oh, well, you should just talk about it. Like, it doesn't seem like an actual secret." Then I don't know. It feels like that's kind of discounting the value, the perceived value of it a little bit, right? And I guess we could talk more about secrets in the next episode to kind of like really dive into that. But to kind of sum up the idea, it's very much like a perceived importance of the thing because it's hidden, right? That's kind of I think what lies behind that.
I'll have a lot to say about secrets. I suppose that's why I was trying to like skirt around the topic because
Yeah,
like I guess the stealth is not really a secret. It's not really like it doesn't really hit the same notes, but it's kind of a secret, but it's
right.
not exactly the same thing. But yeah,
It is the like hidden information angle though, right? Like it's the
yeah,
this I'm doing
it's
a thing and I'm not letting other people perceive it.
yeah. I guess it's kind of a secret.
Yeah.
It can become one, rather. I think like stealth can become a secret.
Yeah. And so like actually this I'm gonna use a good example from Fractured Thrones then. Just to kind of I've done a lot of bad in that angle and I should do some good. That the stealth angle within that experience was very much like we NPCs were effectively told to play dumb NPC guards, uh, which the perspective of that is to say you will absolutely see people walking around the distance and we'll have like these very dedicated sort of like stealthy moments and stealthy characters that definitely blend in better to certain environments and or maybe you just have like an episode that there is like kind of a stealth section where you do get to like kind of sneak around. uh I do have my qualms about like the noise of chainmail and the fact that we had a literal glowing woman as a character that was like sneaking around everywhere and somehow still being treated the same. But regardless of that, the treatment of us as NPCs effectively being able to see everything that was happening and being advised on how to act in a way that still allows it to be valid is like very good. I think that sort of consideration is like while it does kind of like put the NPC role in a sort of like they look stupid sort of vibe, as long as everyone kind of understands that the goal is to allow like not hyper realism to be the case for stealth in that as soon as you see a single pixel of the person you immediately shout them out. No, it's like you're effectively enabling the players to feel cool and stealthy even though you see them doing their thing. And it became very clear the positive impact of that when there was also the negative impact of NPCs that wouldn't do this. There were a few kind of problem people that would effectively call people out as soon as they saw them and would kind of yell out and try to like raise the alarms. And sometimes we'd have to react and kind of say, what are you talking about? There's nothing there, just to like kind of play it down, to kind of bring it back. But effectively, it became very clear that this was like problematic when the problem things happened because I didn't really think about it much until then. Uh, but then I would kind of look back at these sort of scenarios from both sides. I would look at it from kind of the NPC side of like the whole thing happening and being able to perceive, but then like allowing the things happen versus like the player side of like being able to react to these little like what was that? Oh, it must have been nothing sort of
Mhm.
moments. And
I
then
mean,
it's
like
cool, right? Like then they get to like react to those and be like, "Oh shit, I misstepped a little bit. That's not great. I need to like change how I approach things. I need to like react to things, and it makes the whole thing more dynamic rather than just the very dedicated, very objective, like I saw you on my screen, therefore I saw you in character sort of comparison.
I mean, it's literally a meme, right? Like it. Oh, it must have been the wind, you know?
Right.
It's literally a meme, but like
Right.
I don't know. Like I feel like that does kind of like it does kind of fit in with the spirit of like playing to lift, because like that, I mean that's literally what you're doing, right? And
Mhm.
and presumably in a role play, like you're playing to lift each other, so like it's both a give and a take, right? I don't know, like I feel like that is very much in the spirit of playing to lift,
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
long as it's if it's going both ways, then there are no problems,
So I would
same thing
say,
with
go on.
I guess same thing with like stormtrooper aim. If it's good enough for Star Wars, then like you know
Yeah, it's like you get to feel like you're in this like heavy firefight without necessarily being in the immediate danger of everyone has pinpoint aim on you, right? It's even better ultimately that you see
just
all of
like
these shots missing because it gives the illusion of more shots happening.
purposefully miss. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I would recommend that. Like I mean, it's usually like the people playing the NPCs who get told like to have stormtrooper. And like I don't know. Like I just like purposefully miss shots, like as like you know my character, right?
Yep.
Like why not?
I remember the moment I managed to grab a gun as my Neon Divide character, and that we were like effectively chasing off some people from the Undercity. And I got this gun, and I just like one armed the fucking big military scale rifle and just missed everything. Like there was not a single shot hit anywhere near anyone. It was like, no, this is just crazy guy gets a hold of the weapon who doesn't know how to use it, and he's just like, whoa, this is fucking cool, and just doesn't have any sort of know-how on this weird contraption. He's just like he's just weird like that. Though I would say, uh, zooming a little bit back to the play the lift aspect, the glowing woman example and having her be stealthy still, while she's very specifically put a light on her avatar to denote that she was indeed glowing with a radius of light around her, would then inform me to
Yeah,
play the
that,
lift
that
that I can see it, but I was told not to. So that I would say was a failure in the system.
yeah. So like I guess that's yeah. So I guess that there, right? Like having it only be one way, is kind of like
Yeah.
a thing, because like there, right? Clearly the player is interested in doing a thing, but like the systems of that role player are preventing, like, so there is probably in multiple places some miscommunication slash things going wrong. I would hesitate to point to like any one location and be like, well, this is the thing that's wrong. That feels like a multiple things went wrong to arrive to this arrive to that situation. That's what it feels like. Um,
Mhm.
because that's pretty extreme. That's like really silly. Um, you know.
Flying Angel
Um,
says, glowing woman blinding your eyes, thus invis. That did happen too. Multiple times.
yeah. Gosh. That does feel. That does feel like a bit silly, but the blinding would be fine, right? But like at that point, you can't like be like, oh, we don't know that they're there, right? So like that's
Right.
different. Um. Anyway, I think like in short, as the person who's doing the thing, as the actor, right? Do some acting, allow people to interpret what you're doing, play to lift, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. That's um
Such is the way.
allow the allow the perceiver to interpret what you're doing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, we did tangent super hard there. So I guess I will pull us back on topic now. So we talked about reality being subjected from the point of view of the actor, right? The person actually doing the action, right? Understanding that your actions may be perceived in a different way than you intend, and that's okay. Um, what about as the person doing the perceiving, right? What about on their end? What how do you, as the person who's perceiving the action, how do you go about reacting to that?
Right. So I think the way I would kind of start this conversation about the person perceiving is that uh, by this principle, your perception is the reality of your experience, right? So when we think about like what is actually part of your experience in the roleplay, you might like finish a roleplay episode and then you go and like kind of listen to other people's kind of things that they did, and you might think, man, I had no idea this was happening. Well, it's because it wasn't real for you at all, right? And that's fine. That is perfectly fine to understand that is the case, because if you didn't see it happen, if you didn't hear it happen, if you didn't perceive it in any way, then for you it was not a real thing in the roleplay. Now, that being said, reaction requires perception, right? So before you even get to that part, uh, you have to see that thing happening. Well, once you see that thing happening, how do you react to it? I'm struggling to understand what the context of this question is, if I'm gonna be honest. Like reacting to what exactly?
Oh no, I just meant that was like the big topic that we just had with like the actor. I was just thinking about like, okay, let's talk about from the perspective of the perceiver.
Okay, okay, gotcha.
um I guess maybe it doesn't necessitate a reaction, right? And that's, I guess, part of reacting is also maybe not reacting, um that's part of it too, but I just meant more so from, let's talk about things from the perspective of being the perceiver.
Yeah. So like, yeah, let's think about that then. So as this is something that I've fallen into as a sort of trap. Uh, there is sometimes a bit of overlap that makes it very difficult to like reach this sort of mindset, and I've had to kind of work through this a lot. Is I think I have very personally fallen into the trap very often of feeling like I have to act something out in a scenario, rather than just seeing what's happening, right? And by doing that, I effectively push something into a scene without actually like seeing what's going on, without like taking the time to understand it. And for that kind of harms my perception of the reality of the scene, right? So I lose quite a bit by not perceiving as much, by effectively giving myself less opportunity to do that. And I think that happens to a lot of people, in that I know there's a good amount of people that like have a thing they want to say and will like kind of wait for the thing to pass so they have an opportunity to say the thing they want to say. And then the thing to pass ends up actually being something they could have like actually listened to and remembered and understood. So like they basically lose a bunch of reality in the middle of that until this like, buffer period of like I'm waiting for myself to say a thing. And then like you can kind of then like retrospect on that after getting through like a bit more of the scene, and then think, oh well, I actually see it actually seems like I'm going in a different direction here. Uh and that's hard to kind of contend with. So I usually nowadays just kind of, I don't want to say sit back more. I do definitely remain active in scenes. I just don't necessarily go in with a specific goal of like I want to do this and I'm only waiting for the opportunity to do it, because I'd rather react to the current state of the scene as I perceive it, And that way I understand more because I am effectively accepting more into my reality.
There is like there is like a concept in improv um of that kind of like relates to this. I think it's like it's like a concept of playing truthfully in the sense of like the idea is that you're playing a character and you want to when you see something, when you're listening and you're like paying attention to what your scene partners are doing, you want to react in the most truthful way possible. In the sense, it's like this is very much like you can kind of think of it as like it's what my character would do is kind of sort of like that, but the idea is that it's a bit more basic than that, right? It's not you thinking about what your character would do and then doing that thing. Is you skip the step of thinking about what your character would do and you just perceive the thing and react in a way that is natural, right? And part of that is going to be your own personal reaction, maybe colored a bit by, you being in character, right? Um, but it's an idea where it's less like slightly less I guess cerebral in that sense. Um, you kind of like use your own genuine reaction to the things that you're perceiving and color that a bit with with your acting rather than deciding, okay, here's what my character would do, here's what I'm going to do. um and
Mm.
I think that's I don't know, it's like a tough concept. I guess that kind of gets into like acting a little bit.
Yeah, well, I say.
um like it kind of gets into acting a little bit, but it's like it really is like kind of considering your own experience, right? Is part of this. Where
Yeah.
like I think that's kind of like the important part here is like you don't have to ignore your own personal experience, right? Like just because you're role playing a character. Um, right? You as the person in the role play doing the perceiving, right? Like your own experience, your own perception is important, just as like your character's experience and your character's perception, right? Um,
I feel like we've talked about this at length, probably, if I remember correctly, during the play to lift episode. That the it's what my character would do mentality can get very poisonous very quickly because then it can effectively incentivize us to act in ways that are harmful to the roleplay experience for other people by just effectively shutting down other avenues of interaction just because the character would rather be
mhm,
safe, as an example, right? And it kind of ties back in here, like you said, in the capacity that by just marrying yourself to the character's ideals and ways of interaction, that you are effectively uh, removing the part of you that is actually experiencing and again making real the things that you're actually doing. And
mhm.
yeah, like the mentality just tends to get more and more and more and more poisonous. That if you just it's what my character do, it's what my character would do, then you're just simulating the character, and that's it. Instead of
That's
playing a
like
drama with the character.
like in my opinion, that's like I think like the best way to like evidence your reality and like kind of like because as the perceiver, like I know we're talking about like the like there's the actor, the person who did the action, but like you know your reaction to that, like I don't know, somebody like reveals their big secret, your genuine reaction to that, like having like a little bit of that mixed in with whatever the character's doing is like I feel like that's the best way to kind of communicate, you know, what your reality is, right? Like, I mean, if you're, sometimes when you're surprised, you can just, allow yourself to be surprised.
Yeah.
It's like a thing that, it's a thing that happens.
It's the reactive aspect of, like, we've talked about, acting things out and making them obvious, and now we're saying, if you perceive it, you can react. You can react in certain ways. You can react in certain ways that aren't necessarily, oh, the character is going to react as 100%. You basically employ the same sort of principle of, like, here's a benefit of the doubt a little bit. I can, quote unquote, be bad at reacting properly as my character in such a way that, if in the espionage example the person reveals that they have a secret, you don't necessarily immediately leave the conversation, go tell everyone the secret that you just figured out. You play it out, right? You allow the conflict to bubble a little bit. You start to sow distrust, and you once again evidence it back to the person. And that means you draw out the conflict more, you give people more suspense to build upon, and once again, when you resolve a conflict, it ends, right? And that means the roleplay around it ends too. And you kind of want more roleplay for certain things, right? If something's interesting, you want to experience it more. So it really makes sense to just kind of take it in as a character in a certain way, and then as a player in a different way. But by saying, oh well, I can
Mhm.
react in an imperfect way here to make this
Mhm.
more interesting.
Yeah, it is. I think it is a bit freeing and a bit like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
a bit freeing as like the person who's like reacting and finding things out to just like not if being the actor in this context, right? If being the actor was like being okay with the things that you want to happen, right, not happening, right? In this context, right, being the perceiver, I feel like it's about being okay that you don't know everything, right? And you won't be on top of everything because there's just too much information. You're not going to know all of it.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just something that you kind of have to be okay with. I think it's a lot less stressful to roleplay in a situation where you're not kind of like worried about what you are and aren't supposed to know, and like figuring out like, hey, was I supposed to know this thing that this person told me, right? Like, I feel like, like that having to kind of like worry about like the exact flow of information is
Mm-hmm.
really stressful, and kind of like you're kind of like keeping track of things that are necessarily and inherently really hard to keep track of.
The
Um,
ultimate question of, hey GM, do I know about this?
yeah, like that's specifically what I think I was thinking about. It's like I don't know. It's like my character mans the security cameras and like should have seen you sneaking in, I think, right? Like that can be fine. And you can say that, right? Like you can say that. You can be like you can kind of like evidence that. You can be like, "Hey, I manned the security cameras. How in the world did I not see?" I mean, you can have that be a scene, right? Like you can be that.
Yep.
But you can be surprised. Um and the other person can then, play that up as well. And it's fine, right? It's fine. You'll come to a resolution. Both things can be true at the same time, right? You might have like a little bit of a plot hole, but it's fine. You know,
Yeah.
it'll all work out. Um,
Yeah, like you,
and
you can absolutely have those like unusual circumstances of, like, the strange thing happened in quote unquote an out of character context, aka the person got into the facility that I was, securely watching. And then you could just make it interesting by then saying, I'm going to evidence that I should have seen that. And this is your opportunity to be cool, right? Because now you're effectively saying, you've basically bested me. How did you do it? And you're alley ooping them to share all their cool shit with you, right? That's nice. That's a good moment, because then they can like have their whole like little monologue and all that. You're basically setting them up to feel good about themselves, and that just works, right? Uh, I
Yeah.
do I do want to like think about a different concept. This is something I struggle with, so I actually I'm curious how this conversation will go of like how how you generally move around in role play. Like I have seen many different ways that people kind of navigate around different scenes, what they do in their idle time. I have seen many players, and this is something I'm very guilty of. I still do this. I used to do this quite a bit. That will just kind of roam around aimlessly in like common areas, and at some point come across something. This is I managed to do this quite a bit, and I'll find myself, especially when I first started role playing, walking along these common paths way more times than I reasonably should. And I would think like, okay, what would like make sense for me to do here? Because I feel like I'm just trying to find things, and in a sense, it feels like I'm looking for reality to perceive. And realistically, this concept we just talked about really ties into this in that if it is totally okay for me not to perceive everything, then I should be fine with thinking about, getting into my character's mindset a little more of like, what does their day look like? What would they do at this point in the day? And like just kind of immersing myself a little more into that, acting that out a little bit more. If my character would kind of just sit and people watch for like an hour and I feel like doing that, then I can do that. And that's ultimately when I played Rowan, that's a lot of what I did. Is I had a chair set up at the front of the games parlor and I just sat in it for an hour a session until someone would inevitably come up and want to actually play some of the games in the parlor, and then I'd go back with them and chill for a bit. But if no one came by, I would just sit there because I enjoyed seeing the kind of things that would happen as people walked by in the town. And I thought that was fun. And I didn't necessarily need to just roam around everywhere to find things to happen. This was just like the reality of my experience was also included the passing experiences of people as they were walking through. And sometimes I would like catch on with something that would end up being really important and interesting, like very early on, having effectively heard that something was going on and that went around the alleyway, to then find someone injured in another house and walk into that. And then Rowan basically said, "No, I should go back to my work," and then left. Right? I had a chance to evidence something because I saw something that happened, not necessarily looking for it. But it really does come down to like, those opportunities don't need to be like sought after. And again, it is perfectly fine to put yourself in situations where your reality isn't necessarily like containing as many things as possible. There's this very, very large sense of FOMO that I think a lot of people kind of exhibit in VR roleplay that can absolutely be managed by just understanding that other things happen in the session and you can't be a part of all of them, and that is perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm. I think I have another story. It's not another story from Worlds Apart.
Sure.
I think to bring kind of like themes back into it as well a little bit, because there was a thing which at the time, like we the GM team had absolutely no idea how to deal with this. Like we had absolutely no clue what to do, so we kind of just like picked picked something, right? And this was, I think, like a failure on our part as like the team.
Mm.
Um, but very very early into the role play, a large kind of conflict arose between um, sort of the UN gate guards. There are a couple of characters in the UN who are like really into the sort of like we're in the UN, we're like it's kind of like a military thing. We're going to guard the base and like make sure it's safe and secure, right? And, like that, this is important to us. Um, and there was another group of characters, mostly one, but there were multiple, right? I guess mostly Resnair, but there were multiple sort of gremlin characters who were very interested in causing trouble. The players are very very interested in causing trouble and chaos and like the opposite of order and security. Um, and this kind of like led to I think like a very large conflict. Um, we had a big portion of our UN players kind of approached the GMs and kind of told us that they felt very stressed constantly watching the gate, constantly feeling uh, like they constantly have to be there and be alert and be, everything, or else like the security of the base is going to be compromised. And like we tried to like I did have some like theories of like how to solve this. Like the implied presence kind of comes from there. The idea that yes, this base is being manned even if you don't see people there was like one of those ideas that I had at the time, and I think like that was like an okay solution. But even that turned out to not be enough, right? Even like implying that like this base uh, is constantly manned even if you're not there was still not enough to kind of like um, quiet the UN players. They still felt very stressed. That was what was being communicated to us. They were very stressed in role play, and like I don't know, like I don't want anybody to be stressed in my role play. So like we eventually kind of just like decided it's like okay, we were originally going to have this like be a part of the role play. We'll just remove it. It sucks, but like yeah, we'll side with people not being stressed, right? Like that was we kind of made the decision. Like I was looking forward to enabling shenanigans, but like in the absence of like a solution to the problem, right? Like we just couldn't come up with anything. We were going to side with, people not being like stressed to the point of, panicking, right? Um, but clearly that's not a solution, right? That's not a solution. That's just like, cutting off the symptoms. So I've had a long time to think about this sort of situation from here, and I feel like the subjective reality is kind of the root of the problem, um, or the inability. I feel like to have a subjective reality centered around the theme, right?
Mm.
I think this was at first and foremost the thematic failure kind of on like our part as like the staff, and then second as sort of a failure to role play with the subjective reality, right? Like in that order, kind of like first I think it was a thematic failure, second I think it was like the players could have absolutely resolved this disconnect. So let's talk about themes, right? I think in I think like when you have a role play, it's really important to describe like the themes. If part of the themes of your role play is this sort of like militaristic, you know, if you're dealing with themes of like loyalty and order and like that sort of thing, then justice and punishment in a role play like that absolutely. Like in a role play like that, absolutely. Um, watch that gate all day. Go for it. Guard RP, right? Because that's what the role play is about. In a role play that is about those sorts of things, right? It's about like loyalty and justice and punishment and lots of things that you might associate with the sort of like kind of militaristic sort of faction. Um, on the other hand, if your role play is about um, kind of like exploration and like discovering new things and kind of like having fun and like you know all these sorts of things, um, then it's probably a lot less important to talk about like crime and punishment in that role play. And on the third hand, and this is where I think like our failure as the staff was, on the third hand, where when we as the staff think that our role play is about, is primarily about free will and like and then like what you do with that, but your players, right, like a large portion of your player base thinks it's about kind of like order and security, and another large portion of your players thinks it's about hanging out and having fun. Right, now we have like three different realities kind of in competition with each other, right? uh and they're kind of not getting along, right? So I think like first and foremost, we did kind of I think we did have a theme for Worlds Apart. It was not very well enforced. I think that's I would hope that's not very very controversial. We didn't really do a good job of enforcing it, right? We had lots of secrecy in the spy corner. We had people doing like very light milsim in the UN. We had like the sciences doing sciencey stuff, and we had some gremlins, right? We had a lot of different people kind of approaching the role play from very different angles. Um, and so the thing that we thought was our core unifying theme, it was kind of a core unifying theme, but it wasn't really like doing its job of unifying, in this situation. Now, I think personally, like the way that I would have reacted, right? Obviously, I was not in role play; I was GMing, so like it's very easy for me to speak. But like in my perspective, um, you could still have had both, in my opinion, right? Because in this context, right, like neither of those two worlds, neither of those two realities were, I guess, the core theme of Worlds Apart, as dictated, I suppose, by us, the GMs, which we didn't do a very good job of. But like, you know, neither of these two things were ultimately like the true reality, right? So in that context, where you have a in that context, like I think you very well could have had, you know, the gate guards guarding the gate and being like, oh yeah, we're super good at like having this, we have the order, we have the security, we're in control of you know our our base here, right? You could have had that existing alongside of the shenanigans of the characters who are trying to break in, and like it would have felt a little bit like Saturday morning cartoon where it's like, what are they doing today, breaking in, right? But like you could have had both those realities kind of existing, and not it would have been a give and take, right? And it might have been a little bit weird to think about the base is secure and also people are breaking in like every other session, right? But sometimes just that's just what you got to do because you have 40 people in a role play and everybody's reality is different, you know. Sometimes you just got to compromise. Um, but yeah, I think primarily it was a um thematic failure, but like even after the thematic failure, I personally feel like it could have been resolved with a bit of subjective reality. Um we did not feel like I think I remember advocating for this like a little bit, but like we certainly did not have like a full like theory of like what subjective reality meant at the time. So like we just ended up going with, okay, base is secure. You're not getting in without the UN's permission. We ended up going with that route simply because we sided with we don't want people to be panicked, you know. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. That's kind of like the story there. Um, I think that would have been a good place to bring in the subjective reality though. That's what, if I could like, reverse, if we could go back in time, that's the thing that I would change. Though with the asterisk that like, that is like that is an ask on your players, right? That is like something that
Mhm.
would then require your players to play to lift each other and be okay with the subjective reality of the situation.
I think I'm starting to become more enlightened on why this happens more often is a fear of consequences, right? And it depends on the consequence, obviously, within the setting. That like that it feels like players will often lean toward understanding a situation as an objective truth, so they don't misinterpret it in fear of a consequence hitting them in the setting, which can be much more heavily pronounced when the setting leans toward any militaristic sort of angle, because military level consequences fucking suck. It sucks to get yelled at. It sucks to have these sort of like deeper sort of like being called out and then getting grilled for it kind of punishments. Those suck. Right? Those are not fun. And I think in a lot of ways people are kind of avoiding that as much as possible. Which,
Well, I think some people do have fun with those.
yeah.
I feel like some people do absolutely have fun with the sort of like militaristic stuff of like, like failing. It's just like, when somebody else is like not really considering that, right? Like it requires consideration on both parts, right?
Mhm.
It requires kind of like a very high level consideration of like, hey, what is the story that we're telling here? Um, when is it fun to kind of be grilled in this sort of like military sense? And it's like, I think the answer to that is like when you've invited it, right? Like
Mhm.
if I've invited, right, like I've gone and acted out with the explicit purpose of being grilled about it later, then I feel like, that can be quite fun. But the somebody did something without me knowing, and now I'm facing consequences for something that I could not have possibly seen coming, is I feel like it's significantly less fun, and so like
Yeah.
that's where I think kind of like this consideration comes in of like, well, what is the story that we're telling here? Is it truly about justice and crime and punishment and like having all of that be like I would say that like we I think we did make it clear that the Worlds Apart was not about that. Um, or we I think we like repeatedly talked to our players that it wasn't about that. And in that context, but I still understand. I think I still absolutely understand kind of like that feeling, that fear of being punished in that case for something that like A, you didn't really do, and B, you didn't really want to explore, right? Right. You didn't want to explore the punishment in that moment.
Mhm.
Um and yeah, it's like, yeah, that absolutely sucks. So there is like a very high level of trust that needs to be in place for you to be able to explore that sort of thing, right?
Right.
In a safe way. That's not stressful.
Mm.
Um, and I think I think this is like one of those places where you know us being clear on the themes and having safety mechanics would have come a long way. Because that feels like this is also, now that I'm talking about it more, this definitely feels like a player safety situation as well. People being stressed
Right.
over the thing, right? It's very
Yeah.
legitimate. Kind of like communicating that this is not a scene that I want to have right now, right? This is not a I'm not interested in, you know, this form of role play.
Yeah.
Having that ability to advocate for yourself, I think would have come a long way.
Yeah. I think like, I mean, I was mostly just calling out like that is the source of fear, right? Is I might not catch the thing that happens, and because of me not catching it, it'll come back to bite my ass later, and I don't want that to happen. When in reality, getting to calibrate later on, if it comes down to that, in the worst case scenario, is like very easy. Well, I don't want to say very easy. It is very reasonable to do if you have the safety mechanics to do it with, right? If you have a calibration mechanic and you say you think like I don't want to be a part of this scene. This is not something I want to explore right now. I don't want to be yelled at. This is not fun for me. You can say it by calibrating with one of those mechanics by saying, let's go a different direction. And then the other person says, you know what, cool, yeah, let's do it. And then you go in a direction that both of you can enjoy, and that's great. Uh, then looking Jack just strictly at this principle too, it can at least be mitigated by the understanding on both sides. One being kind of the perceptive end of it's okay to not know everything that happens, and to be able to react to things that come after that. And then B, the person that does perceive the thing happening to understand that not everyone perceives the same thing, and to react or act upon those sorts of situations where something does go wrong and the character would normally react pretty heavily as like, I have to potentially contend with the fact that this is new information to someone, and I have to treat it like that. Because again, if you do end up in that circumstance of I saw nothing leading up to this point and I'm being blindsided by something that very heavily affects my character, then if it is something that you have a very hard time contending with, that kind of sucks. But if you have that lead up and some sort of clue in, then obviously that's not always possible, but it helps if you do have that, right? Because then it's real to you, and it's real.
Hmm.
All right.
Yeah,
Go on.
I think that kind of like sums it up quite nicely. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's a hard topic, and I guess we've kind of come back to the topic of trust, and like that's like the big thing with subjective reality. Like subjective reality is predicated on trust, right? Which we are assuming at this point, right? Because we've already talked about uh I guess we've already talked about that quite a lot, but that's why, that's where this comes from, right? The ability to have a subject to reality is predicated on the ability to trust each other. And trust, right, is something that needs to be cultivated. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not it's not something that is taken for granted.
It's crazy how we keep coming back to these very fundamental concepts again and again, as if everything ties together. You know,
Yeah,
it's absolutely wild. So, do we have anything else to go over? I think we've kind of,
I think we've covered most everything.
yeah. Okay. So, as a summary, action is not the same as perception. So, from the acting end, make things as perceivable as possible. And from the perceiving end, understand that you will not necessarily perceive everything that will possibly happen within the roleplay, and be fine with having that contained perspective of the experience, because that is what is real to you as the player, as the audience of other people's role playing. All right. So, as always, the chat within the Twitch channel and also the stage channel and the Married Discord are open to questions. Have been, but still are for the remainder of this for this outro, which I fully believe is short for outroduction. But to look, they can't just say outro and then not believe it's outroduction when intro exists. All right. I mean, come on. It's got to be a word. I'm making it a word. So this is the outroduction. So this has been the On the Couch podcast. If y'all want to read more, there is the information right there in the Twitch chat. That Couchform is a style of roleplay that we have written out that focuses on building around a core theme, designed to support them, and playing to lift the scenarios within it, along with other principles like the one we've discussed today. If you want to learn more, the core principles document is right there, which also links to this Discord server where the document is housed. And we discuss further on other roleplay principles and other ideas and share some of those as little mints of knowledge. So yeah, that is what we have talked about here, talking about kind of this deeply philosophical core concept, but then relating it in a way that's very practical to the roleplay medium, and specifically VR roleplay, and what we do as both actors and role players within the settings that we like to play within. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Anything you wanted to shout out?
Not in particular. I don't know. I think like I posted an image in the Discord of the Metal Gear Solid thing, but like it's not super. That's about the only thing, but oh well. I don't have anything in particular to shout out.
It's a great picture.
Yeah.
All right. Then, with that being said, this was episode 10 of the On the Couch podcast. Next.
2 more.
What? What's that?
2 more.
2 more. Oh my god, there's 2 more.
We're getting there.
Game. We're in the end game now, and the last 2 are still good. So next episode, we are going to be talking about secrets. Episode 11 will be about secrets, and of course, why they are never needed. All right, till then, take care, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.